Hello and hola. I am so excited to welcome everyone here today to the second event in this year's Diverse Perspectives in Digital Media and Design speaker series. To paraphrase James Baldwin, nothing can be changed until it is faced. This is certainly true of the inequities that have historically shaped the entertainment industry, both on screen and behind the scenes. This event today is brought to you by UConn's Department of Digital Media and Design and El Instituto, the Institute of Latino, Caribbean, and Latin American Studies. We would like to, looking for my mouse, sorry. We would like to begin today's event by acknowledging that the land on which we gather here in Storrs, Connecticut is the territory of the Mohegan, Manchatucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hoapaguset, Nipmuc, and Lenape peoples who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. Today's event will feature a candid conversation with our special guest, Ricardo Dominguez, followed by a Q&A with a co-host and questions from the virtual audience. Please take advantage of the YouTube chat box to submit questions for Ricardo, which we will try to answer during the discussion. I'm Heather Elliott Familaro, and I'm the department head for digital media and design at the University of Connecticut. DMD is a young department which has rapidly grown to over 350 undergraduate and graduate students and 26 full-time faculty. We have 7 undergraduate concentrations across the full digital media spectrum: film production, animation, interactive media, business, and the humanities at both the Storrs and Stanford campuses. And in our department, we value and celebrate our students' diverse backgrounds, and we support their development both as individuals and as professional media creators and artists. This Diverse Perspectives in Digital Media and Design speaker series is one of celebration of these shared values. Now on to today's show. It is my extreme pleasure to welcome today's co-hosts, Professor Kelly Dennis and DMD graduate student, Kate Campolieta. Kelly Dennis is an art historian and visual media scholar who has researched and taught digital and internet art since 2006, including a chapter on internet art in her first book, Art Porn, A History of Theory and Seeing, published in 2009. Dr. Dennis is an associate professor of digital culture in the DMD department, and she is an information activist in her work as a network organizer for art and feminism Wikipedia edit-a-thons, which we just had last week, for which she has been organizing events and training students and the public to participate since 2017. Welcome, Kelly.
Hola.
And I'm also happy to introduce our student co-host, Kate Campolieta. I'm saying it wrong, Campolieta. You put the enunciation, I'm getting it wrong every time. Campolieta. Kate is a creative-minded graduate student in the digital media and design, focusing on film and video production. She graduated last spring from the University of Pittsburgh with a bachelor's in communications, and she's currently working as a videographer for the Boston Pride, a professional women's hockey team in Boston. Welcome, Kate.
Cool.
Hi, thank you.
And now I'm going to turn the virtual mic over to you, Kelly.
Okay. Thank you, Heather. I can't find my cursor either. There we go. Thank you, Heather. It's my extreme pleasure to welcome today's special guest, the artist and chair of the Department of Visual Arts at the University of California, San Diego, Ricardo Dominguez, who's going to present his perspectives on taking flight with Ricardo Dominguez. Dominguez is a founding member of Critical Art Ensemble, a collective of tactical media practitioners formed in, wait for it, 1987, way before most of you were actually even thinking about the web. He's also a co-founder of Electronic Disturbance Theater 1.0, which is a group that developed virtual sit-in technologies in solidarity with the Zapatista communities in Chiapas, Mexico in 1998. With the Electronic Disturbance Theater 2.0 Bang Lab project, including Brett Stahlbaum, Misha Cardenas, Amy Sarah Carroll, El Mermad, and Dominguez, they created the Transborder Immigrant Tool, or TBT, which is a GPS cell phone safety net tool for crossing the Mexico-US border. And this won the Transnational Communities Award in 2008, which is funded by the Cultural Contact Endowment for Culture Mexico, US, and handed out by the US Embassy in Mexico. Nevertheless, as testament to its effectiveness and impact, Dominguez was under investigation for 3 years for this project by the FBI, Congress, and his home institution of University of California at San Diego. The Transborder Immigrant Tool has been exhibited in many national and international venues, and recent honors include Cuánto tiempo lleva todo esto derramándose, sin desbordarse, yeah, most of it, which is translated means how long has all this spilled without overflowing? And this is a retrospective exhibition at the Center for Digital Culture in Mexico City, Mexico, that surveys 40 years of his creative work. He was also the UCLA Luskin Institute at the Institute on Inequality and Democracy Fellow just last year in 2021. He was a Society for the Humanities Fellow at Cornell University and a Rockefeller Fellow in Bellagio Center, Italy, as well back in 2018. I'd say back because it's not really that long ago. I make it sound longer than it is. Ricardo, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, and take it away.
Muchas gracias, Kelly. Muchas gracias, Heather y toda la comunidad. That was really wonderful to go through the process of, speaking multiple languages of care and kindness in terms of considering where we are. I'm in the Kumeyaay territories and lands, the living breath of the communities that are here and upholding where the University of California, San Diego is. So thank you. I've been a co-creating, collaborating artist now for a very long time. And so I'll take you through some of the gestures that I'm attaching to the notion of lines of flight. Perhaps it's overused now, but I think it's still an interesting way to approach things. Hopefully you're able to see the screen and PowerPoint here. As was noted, I'm an associate professor, chair, principal investigator at California Information Technology 2, also known as the Qualcomm Institute. And as was mentioned, I was a part of Critical Art Ensemble, Electronic Disturbance Theater. Bang Lab stands for Bits, Atoms, Neurons, and Genes. Also the Particle Group and many other different groups over the years. So I'll begin at the beginning, which is just a sort of a linear way to get on the runway and take off on these multiple zones of practices. So I'm going to cover about 5 lines of flight that I'm going to place under the notion of tactical gestures, and we can certainly discuss the difference between tactical and strategic, at least the way I interpret those aesthetic practices. So micro gestures might be the first line of flight. So I was born in El Paso, Texas, which is on the Juarez and El Paso border, US-Mexico border, but I was not there very long. I was only there for about 6 months, and then my family took off and landed in fabulous Las Vegas, Nevada. So that even before the famous book, Learning from Las Vegas from 1974, I think by the architect Venturi, I was already very much learning from Las Vegas. And what I discovered in Las Vegas was a series of layers that are very much manifesting even now here in San Diego. In Las Vegas, there was a territory between what we would call military research structure. Most of Nevada is military, 98% is military. It was also what we might call mafia capitalism, since much of the casino culture I grew up in was in the moment of transferring from older mob-driven casino culture to corporate casino culture. There was also a deep Mormon community that was foundational in its politics. And so you had military, mafia, Mormons, and then you had money, lots of money. And I was a Mexican, so M plus M plus M plus M plus M plus M allows you to begin to understand what it means to be in Las Vegas. So one of the qualities of being in Las Vegas is that I was able to see nuclear bombs go off being tested at the Nevada test site about 100 miles north of Las Vegas. So here I am with my mom enjoying the nuclear blast on a Saturday afternoon. The sirens would go off, and then the bomb would go off. And unlike earthquakes, which are shivering and shuddering, it was like a smooth series of waves that you could run out into the middle of the street and surf. And indeed, I often did. I would go to the top of the Mint Hotel in Las Vegas, Nevada, buy a 99-cent monster burger, and then wait for the beatific explosion of the Cold War and its territories of nuclear war. And of course, if you just turned a little bit to the left, you would be in Area 51, where our alien communities, our ETs, were supposedly gathering and sharing their insights. And then also Nellis Air Force, which was the second largest Air Force base in the nation, and a lead in experimental engines like the X-15 and the F-11 and many other kinds of war machines. So it was a highly militarized zone, a nuclear zone, much to learn from. And when I would go to see these nuclear bombs, after the bomb went off, I would turn on my little black and white RCA portable TV that was given to me at birth and by my father just for being born. It probably weighed more than all of the university that you're at, this little portable RCA. But after the nuclear bomb would go off and the patriotic anthems of the Cold War, that this was a good thing, my television, my screen would tell me that these nuclear bombs were going to create giant monsters, creatures in the desert of the real that would come for us, eat us, destroy us. In fact, here is one such mutant literally attacking Las Vegas, the Sand Hotel, and casino. So I had a kind of schizophrenic encounter between the beatific, sublime, patriotic Cold War nuclear explosions and what my screenal portable RCA TV was telling me was a territory of the production of monsters. So this was part of learning from Las Vegas, the schizoanalytic condition, if you will, which often is the territories of a kind of applied fiction, applied simulation that I learned from Las Vegas, with its neon turbo territories of simulation as well. And one of the things that I think I repeat over and over, as artists, you might, and as thinkers, you might repeat or inhabit certain gestures that continue forth. And so one of the qualities of having an RCA black and white television as a little baby, basically, was that I loved the glowing tubes in that RCA. In those days, there were glowing tubes. And so I took the warm milk that my mother had given me in my bottle, and I put it in my portable RCA black and white. It blew up. And this gesture, I think, occurs in so much of my work. I'm deeply in love with technology, but I always find the simplest gesture or micro gesture to disturb that technology. In this case, it was warm mother's milk. So there was a way to interact with what the television was telling me about the state of affairs of the world I found myself in fabulous Las Vegas, and these kind of micro gestures that allow a certain disturbance to begin to emerge. So I'm going to leap in time, take flight, and I'm going to leave Las Vegas, and I'm going to land in early 1980, late 1975 in Tallahassee, Florida. When I graduated from high school, I got a car, and my family said, well, you know, it's time for you to go. So good luck to you. And so I decided I would take this old car and go to Miami. I don't know why, but I just thought it might be interesting. But the car died in Tallahassee, Florida, in front of a lesbian bookstore called Ruby Fruit Books, named after Rita Mae Brown's famous lesbian novel, Ruby Fruit Jungle. And the community there took me in. I became a book buyer and bookseller. And there I began to read all sorts of really fascinating new kind of thinking that I had never encountered before. That is post-structuralism, critical theory. I began to read lesbian critical culture by Monique Wittig, Cixous. I began to think about the things that I loved right before I got to Tallahassee, Florida, and that was agitprop theater, a la Teatro Campesino, who did work out in the fields to support Cesar Chavez. I was deeply fascinated in the 70s with performance art, body art, Abramovic, Anconci. But when I landed in Tallahassee, I felt that I was really just repeating these cultures of agitprop theater and performance art, and I wanted to do something else, but it was unclear what it was. So I was reading a great deal, and I began to meet other young artists there in Tallahassee, Florida, what we might call the cultural frontier. And these artists are here before you. The gentleman with the mustache is Steve Barnes. He was the first person I ever met who had even seen a computer, and he hated computers. And then next to him was Dorian Burr, who was a photographer, and she hated photography. And I was a performance artist, a political agitprop artist who hated performance art and agitprop performance and theater. And next to me was Hope Kurtz, a poet who hated poetry. And then next to her was Steve Kurtz, an experimental filmmaker who hated experimental films. So you can see a theme. We were young and we hated the aesthetic project that we had been obsessed with. So we gathered together. We quit the work of our own aesthetic fetishes, if you will, and we began to create an ensemble in which we began to investigate and elucidate ways of making that didn't necessarily follow our desire or demands, but moved and mobilized in other directions. So one of the things we began to do was to develop a way of seeking in poetry what we came to call utopian plagiarism. We did handmade books. You can't love poetry more than to make handmade books. And not only were we making these books by hand, but we were developing a tactic of what we call utopian plagiarism, where we would add a word or two to a found text in order to assemble a new meaning. And taking up the history of the Dadaists and Situationists in terms of détournement, this became important, especially when the FBI and other communities started coming to sort of take a look at the projects that we were doing. And they would often say, you guys are using poetry and art as camouflage. But we would always point to the work that we were doing here. We made handmade poetry books. Now, one of the things I began to investigate other than utopian plagiarism, which I'll get to, were micro gestures. And micro gestures were a way to explore through minimal circumstances and minimal objects and minimal gestures, micro gestures, a way to disturb the social field of conversation. Now, in 1981, malls were new. I don't know if any of you have ever been to a mall, but they were new. And malls were basically, we discovered, simulations of public agoras, simulations of public space. The only right you had in this public space was to purchase or buy, to have commodities. And so, like Las Vegas, it was a simulated space of public culture. So what I did is I wanted to investigate what this space was. I would go into a mall with about $20, buy things, had a Burger King hat. But unlike other sort of clear commodity fetishists who take their commodities home, unwrap them, and then share them with that little intimate space of your home to wear, I just broke it out excitedly. I wasn't blocking the exit doors. I wasn't blocking the movement of cars. I was just playing with my commodities. And almost instantly, community would gather, security forces would gather, and they would say, is this a Vietnam vet? Is this a houseless person? Is this somebody that needs mental health support? And so a dialogue would occur. And so I never said anything. And so this was a sense of an aesthetic that I merged with critical art ensemble and utopian plagiarism that you will see in a little bit. So one of the elements that was also happening about midway into this period of research was that by the end of the 80s, we began to see a lot of our friends beginning to die of something called AIDS and a great hysteria in this endemic, a presidency that was not paying attention to this. And at this moment, as this was emerging, Critical Art Ensemble had already begun to establish thinking with the use of microgestures and utopian plagiarism, a way to develop a performative matrix around electronic disturbance. And what happened was that we were reading Thoreau's On Civil Disobedience from 1848 against the Mexican-American War, the expansion of the slavery or enslaving states. And we added, through utopian plagiarism, electronic to the text of Thoreau's On Civil Disobedience. So we had electronic civil disobedience. So we were able then to start developing ideas around electronic disturbance and electronic civil disobedience, microgestures, and they really came together when many of our friends began to die in Tallahassee, Florida, because of the uncaring state who was not really paying attention to this emerging endemic pandemic of AIDS, HIV. So out of this practice, we then started doing cultural vaccine projects or ACT UP initiated projects, which is AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, Tallahassee. We began to do direct action with the idea that they would have a digital component. We didn't exactly know how, but electronic civil disobedience was part of the discourse. We would do fax jams, call jams, adding to our notion of an emerging hacktivism. Even though ourselves, we didn't have computers, we did begin to theorize a practice. I also returned to body art at this time. Blood was a core element of the hysteria. So I would do work with blood around critical virus gestures or cultural vaccine gestures that were part of ACT UP Tallahassee. All of this came together through a series of writings that we at Critical Art Ensemble did. The first book was called Electronic Disturbance. It is copyleft or copy riot. It wasn't published until 1994, but you can certainly read it and say it was a product of the 80s, and we didn't have access to computers. So it was theorization around these practices of microgestures, of electronic disturbance, of utopian plagiarism, and of a new question that had emerged for us in the 80s, the relationship between data bodies and real bodies. What was this performative matrix? What was it that was developing in virtual capitalism that was similar to Las Vegas neon capitalism, where data bodies were becoming much more valuable to virtual capitalism than real bodies, the bodies in the streets, the bodies dying of HIV, the bodies across the worlds that did not meet the standards of the data body. And so electronic civil disobedience was going to be part of this response. And so we wrote another series of essays called Electronic Civil Disobedience and Other Unpopular Ideas that developed ways of thinking trespass and blockage of the long history from Thoreau to Gandhi to Martin Luther King to ACT UP of nonviolent direct action only online. And so this was the way that I then ended up in New York City in early 1990. And there, with these theories, with these practices, I wanted to find infrastructure. I wanted to gain access to actual computers to begin initiating digital disturbances focused on the terms and ideas of electronic civil disobedience. And I found a group of artists called The Thing. The Thing was an internet service provider, which was a new thing, right? There was AOL, American Online, the beginnings of Yahoo. And so what was important about The Thing, started by artist Wolfgang Stahler, a conceptual artist that had made his money in the 80s in conceptual painting in New York. And he had spent his money on modems and connecting the beginnings of a social sculpture, if you will. And I was lucky enough to meet Wolfgang and the communities there in New York, and to be allowed to explore the actual machine and to explore what electronic civil disobedience might be. Now, in 1981, I read an essay by the RAND Corporation, the leading think tank for the US military. And in 1991, Ron Felton Aquila wrote an essay called Cyber War is Coming. And this was really a prayer for the economics and wealth that would come from cyber terrorism, cyber war, cyber crime. You can add cybersecurity, but they never mention electronic civil disobedience. So I thought that the RAND Corporation's diagram would be a perfect arena for me to stage a performative matrix around electronic civil disobedience, but it would carry with it a cyber poetics. I wasn't exactly sure how it would function, but that was the general performative matrix. The Critical Art Ensemble thought that it would be organized by a cell of highly lucid technologists or hackers who would take on the territory of electronic civil disobedience. They would be anonymous, they would be secretive, they would be functioning at a level that very few could. At least that's the way I approached it. But I was still thinking about cyber poetics, and I still felt there was something missing. And that missing element was that in the cyber zapatistas that emerged at 1 minute after midnight 1994 as the free trade zone agreement between Canada, the US, and Mexico was signed, NAFTA. At that moment, at that midnight hour, the Zapatistas emerged in cyberspace. The Zapatistas were a group of indigenous communities in Chiapas, Mexico, who did not have telephones, did not have computers, did not even speak English, Spanish as their dominant language. Yet within 6 hours of emerging online, ripping through the electronic fabric, the New York Times said they were the first network activist group ever to have manifested themselves so rapidly, so deeply, and so aesthetically. And so the Zapatistas became a key ground for me. They came to New York City. They began to train me. I was part of the New York Committee for Democracy in New York, or the Zapatistas of New York, and I began to show them how we at Critical Art Ensemble at the Thing had started to establish the idea of electronic civil disobedience. And they said, no, what you need to do is create poetic narratives. You need to create applied fictions, like the stories of Pedrito, the 2.5-year-old boy who had Mayan technology. That is, here we needed to flow with Mayan technology, with Pedrito, the 2.5-year-old child. So what I did is I started protesting in the streets, while at the same time thinking about how to establish the cyber poetics of digital zapatismo and electronic civil disobedience. So it was in conversation with the Zapatistas that I began to use digital conceptualism, developing simple online presence with different community around the world, specifically University of Texas at Austin. At the same time, this is another thing is happening. I was in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, living there. Nobody wanted to go to Williamsburg in those days. They thought, you would disappear if you went to Williamsburg, which was only one stop from Manhattan. And there I started working with a group of net artists, emerging net artists there in Williamsburg called Fake Shop. And we started using what is called CUC-Me systems, Cornell University CUC-Me, which was like Zoom, but it was tiny postage stamp, barely visible, barely sonified systems. But we began to play with them, developing different performances. And one of the gestures we would do is replay 1970 science fiction films like Coma, where they would organ harvest strong and robust young people and sell their organs online. So we would use CUC-Me as a way to play with these speculative fictions. And it was out of CUC-Me that I then began to have conversations with Digital Zapatismo and began to establish a year-long performance at MIT and at pseudo.com in New York and at the Thing, Rabin Alaki, Zapatista Port Action, which was the use of these technologies to have conversations with international and global groups of Zapatistas to establish digital Zapatismo and the performative matrix that I hope for electronic civil disobedience. Out of this series of year-long projects came Electronic Disturbance Theater. The group of artists, I always work with artists. I always work with 5 at all possible, the Anarchist Cell. And part of this group was The Thing, Wolfgang Stahler. And there you can see on the man with the beard is Stephen Ray, an information war scholar about Mexico and the US from University at Austin, University of Texas at Austin. I had read his early work on information war. Then right next to him is Carmen Karasik, a bug hunter up at MIT. Any bug in code, she would be able to find it and fix it. And then myself, and then the gentleman you see with the glasses is Brett Stahlbaum, a young artist in California that I met and was investigating new modes of net art. And we came together. We never met in person. And for 10 years, we established the development towards the practice of electronic civil disobedience. Now, one of the things that we did was that at that time in the 90s, opacity was important in online culture. That is, the ads for Yahoo or AOL would say, in cyberspace, nobody knows you're a cat, right? It was about being camouflaged and opaque. And so we decided that we would be transparent and that we would tell the Mexican government, that we were going to do an electronic civil disobedience action against them in a transparent way. I lived in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, where we lived, what kind of code we were going to create, when we were going to do this action. It was a way to bring the Gandhian tradition of satyagraha and online action. So the police or the authorities knew exactly where you were, and they could come and arrest you or hit you, just like communities who were blocking the street. It was a way to bring data bodies and real bodies together. And we launched the Zapatista Floodnet, the virtual sit-in tool. It grew that year, and it was in response to the Acteal massacre of December 21st, 1997. We launched the virtual sit-in technology, and it grew and grew in terms of its performance. We ended up doing the largest one at Ars Electronica, a very famous digital art program. It was called InfoWar. It was the largest one we had ever done. I did embodied performances about digital zapatismo, and it was at that time that we did an action against the Department of Defense, the President of Mexico, and the Frankfurt Stock Exchange. And the Department of Defense launched the first known information war weapon at us, the first time it had ever been seen. And this launched then this large argument about information war weapons, and that the United States had broken the US Posse Comitatus law by shutting down our servers in New York City. And so that was really the end of that performance, and we gave away the code, the disturbance developers kit, and that created large-scale hacktivism as it is known now. So again, that's that particular part of it. The next line of flight is delaying deportation flights, 2001, tactical delays. So one of the things that happened in 2000 was that I was contacted by the No Borders community in Germany that had seen the work that we had done at Ars Electronica. And they came to me and they said, Ricardo, can Electronic Disturbance Theater help us with the deportation class actions and take down Lufthansa? Because what the German government had done is made deals with private corporate carriers to use them as deportation class planes. They would mummify immigrants, strap them down in first class or second class or whatever class, and then drop them off in their quote unquote home country. But a number of immigrants died when they were mummified because the helmets that were used to quiet them were too big. These were usually young people and women, and it asphyxiated them. So they died. And so they asked us to help them. So we went to Germany. We went and established deportation class processes to show them how to do transparent e-protest, virtual sit-ins. We created newspapers. We let everybody in Germany know what we were going to do, how we were going to do it, the code that we were doing. We would dress up like deportation class Lufthansa people and hand out information about what the German government and Lufthansa were doing. We then let everybody know that we were going to do this online demonstration. Lufthansa went down. The German pilots union, as well as servers union, said they would never fly another deportation class, and they signed papers. The stockholders said they would never do another deportation class action. Now, one of the things that came out of this particular action was that a year later, we were brought before the court in Frankfurt as cyber terrorists. The lower court said that we were cyber terrorists and were going to be fined and put in jail. But then the higher court of Frankfurt said that the lower court was wrong, that electronic civil disobedience was a civil right for civil society, or specifically German society at that time, or larger scale EU. And so we won the case, and electronic civil disobedience became part of the guiding infrastructure of law, of guaranteed rights for citizen protest and contestation. The next line of flight, border gestures, flight facilitation. So in 2004, I was hired for all of this to be a professor at University of California, San Diego. I was hired to be a principal investigator at Cal IT 2, California Information Technology 2, a transdisciplinary institute. And I told them I was going to do three things. I was going to explore electronic civil disobedience or hacktivism using the supercomputers at UCSD and to use it against nation states, corporations, communities that we thought needed protest. And I was also interested in using it against the UC system as well, because I was interested in the notion of institutional critique. Two, I was going to explore the history of border art, developing border disturbance technology. I didn't know what that was going to be, but I was going to focus on that research. The last level of research, or co-equal, was nanotoxicology, nanopoetics. I was interested in the emergence of nanotechnology and getting a hold of atomic force microscopes and looking at the lack of nanotoxicity that was being done on global products that use nanotechnology, but very few humans were using it, and it was creating difficult and physiological reactions. Now, it didn't take much for me to create a micro gesture wherein the Border Patrol came. I stood at the border with my UCSD looking at the utopian future to come in front of the surveillance cameras at the border, and Border Patrol immediately came and said I could not stand looking at the future, smiling. I had to wander away sadly. So anyway, it was the standard. There, I began a group of Electronic Disturbance Theater 2.0. Brett Stahlbaum, that you see there with the green shirt. Next to him is Amy Sarah Carroll, poet and scholar, experimental poet and scholar of the border. Behind me is Ellie Mermad, one of my first MFAs, a sonification and mixed reality artist. And next to Ellie is Misha Cardenas, trans poetic and MFA, one of my first MFA students, now a part of this thing called Bang Lab as well, bits, atoms, neurons, and genes. So I started exploring the possibilities of creating what is now the Transborder Immigrant Tool. This came about through a discussion with my longtime collaborator, Brett Stahlbaum, net artist and digital artist. I was interested in locative media, a GPS-based art, but I wasn't really interested in the kind of work that was being developed. As all of you might know, GPS was given to us by the quote unquote military in 2000 for civilian use. And a lot of artists began to use it, but it was mainly around urban-based aesthetics, layering Palestine on San Francisco, which I always thought was really interesting. But Brett Stahlbaum and his partner Paula Poole really loved to wander dangerous areas of the desert and really loved to get lost, but they also get lost. So what do? So they started using this artificial intelligence system to try to create difficult guides throughout the desert. And I thought that was really fantastic. I really liked that. And I asked Brett, what if we were to convert it into a safety net tool for sustenance, and instead of GPS, a global positioning system, for a geopoetic system that would offer communities crossing the Devil's Highway directionality, sustenance. And we created the Transborder Immigrant Tool, working with NGOs like Water Station Inc. and Border Angels that leave water, and it would guide you, tell you how far you were from water. It would give you survival poetry that was used by the military. If you ever landed in a desert, the military would train you how to cross and survive. And so we did that with poetry in multiple languages, from indigenous languages to Russian to Chinese to English. We put ads in the newspapers showing how it worked. And then, what happened was that the Congress found out about it, the right wing found out about it, the FBI found out about it. And even though my university had funded it because I had given a job talk and they'd given me funding, they decided to try to detenure me because of this. And the right wing was really freaked out that explicit poetry was helping quote unquote illegals. The other thing that the right wing said was that the poetry would dissolve the border, which I always thought was really fascinating. But for 3 years, we had to stop the project. We started it in 2007. So about end of 2010, after many legal battles and difficulties, we won. But the tool was no longer really useful because the narcos had taken over the informal coyote trade or of flight facilitation. And so it became extremely dangerous for someone to have something like this. And so it's been translated into other environments, especially around the Mediterranean. And so now the question I want to go to is lines of flight or flight patterns or dronology gestures. As you might know, or I can tell you, my university, University of California, San Diego, is a highly militarized university in a militarized area in San Diego. That is, we have more militarized research than probably any other place on the planet. Paramilitary, spies, Navy, atomic, general atomics, and we're also, most importantly, Drone Valley. We produce 98% of all the armed potential drones, like the Predator drone, the most famous here at this university and this community. So we wanted to draw attention to drones at home. And we started doing tactics that would alert our faculty and even researchers who don't know that what they're doing really, and students. And so with students, we started doing gestures that would begin to alert the community that we were in Drone Valley. Now, what happened was that a drone crashed at the famous Dr. Seuss library. Everybody was quite freaked out about this drone crash. And I was then offered by the University of California Office of the President, who only a few years before had tried to detenure me, to be the principal investigator for the UC Center of Drone Policy and Ethics. And so I began to investigate this event. Here's the Center for Drone Policy and Ethics. You can see our Triton holding the drone since we're so deeply enmeshed in all of this. And this led me to the latest project, which is the Palindrome. And this is going to be a drone that's about a third of the size of the Predator drones or the drones that traditionally cross the US-Mexico border for homeland security or are used for signature strikes in different parts of the world. And this palindrome, because the border is the same forwards it is backwards, is a search and sing system. And it will sing to the drone pilots about the culture of the border, the music, the theory, and the voices that perhaps they are unaware of, and hopefully create a sense of disturbance around what these pilots at Critch, Nevada, driving these homeland security drones might perhaps a sense about the communities that they are constantly placing under surveillance, that refugees, immigrants, climate refugees, economic refugees from around the world are driven by aesthetic projects, cultural valiancies, co-equal to anything on the north side of the border. Again, a simple gesture, a micro gesture that disturbs the conditions that are found in the territories that I am a part of. So I'll stop there and open it for dialogue or communication. Muchas gracias.
Yeah, thank you so much for talking with us. That was a really amazing presentation. Yeah, I just wanted to jump into some questions that people from the class had. So first of all, I just wanted to touch back on the electronic disturbance theater. I was wondering how you feel that it's changed in the past couple decades, from sort of where it started and what it's turned into. I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little more about that.
In terms of, you mean the practices of electronic civil disobedience versus in terms of transparency as the aesthetic logic versus what, say, Anonymous is doing right now, say, against the Russian networks, right, in protest with Ukraine. Well, I think the aesthetic difference is that electronic disturbance theater always functioned in that period, right, of the 90s as transparent because everything was about anonymity, right? They sold anonymity as the project, right? You can be on AOL and nobody knows who you are, nobody knows. And so that to be transparent was disturbing. But what happened after 9/11 was that transparency became a key guide for banks, governments, power. Everything was about transparency. Surveillance was about transparency. So you began to see that individuals were really thinking about opacity and camouflage. Our data bodies cannot be transparent, it's dangerous. And so I think Anonymous was interesting in that they carried the tradition of this anonymity, right? The original vision of Critical Art Ensemble, that it was a group of deep infrastructure technologists taking direct action that was opaque and not transparent. So I think that's what's different between what Electronic Disturbance Theater 1.0 was doing and, say, Anonymous now. But what is interesting about Anonymous when it first emerged, if you remember, was its battle against Scientology. And so they took to the streets wearing the vendetta mask, right? And so that was really interesting because in the 80s and 90s, quote unquote, those kinds of hackers like 2600 would never go to the streets, would never protest in the streets. So that was an interesting code switch at that moment, that these hackers wanted to be embodied, but anonymous at the same time. And this became a key question with the transborder immigrant tool, because we didn't want the users to be transparent, right? For the GPS to locate an immigrant, a refugee, a crosser in the desert, that wasn't, we thought, useful. So, but we as EDT wanted to be transparent. That is, we wanted to say, it's us building this thing, it's us distributing this, right? So then Amy Sarah Carroll, the poet, said, what if we were translucent, right? We were transparent as the group, the end user was opaque, but the gesture was translucent. So it allowed us to sort of create a performative matrix between camouflage, opacity, transparency, and then this kind of synthesizing aesthetic of the translucent, which became really important when facing the FBI and the Department of Defense and Congress, in that they became obsessed with poetry, right? They thought that the poetry was secret, encrypted. And they said, is this poetry encrypted, secret? And we said, all poetry is encrypted. All poetry has secrets in it, right? I've read T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland many times, and I still don't fully understand its secrets, right? So I think those are the differences between EDT in the 90s and EDT post 9/11. I'll stop there.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting to hear how that sort of thing can evolve over time. So going back to sort of the earlier days of digital activism, you seem to find a connection between activism and the internet far earlier than a lot of other people did. So how were you able to make this connection so early? What sort of inspired you to use digital platforms as your main platform, basically?
Well, again, I was a screenal child, right? I spent all my time in front of a black and white portable television. And it told me all this, right? I saw endless science fiction movies that alluded or hinted at this, right? And then one of the things happened in 1981, a really terrible film emerged called Tron, right? But it had a great idea that somehow one could create a data body against the master, a code, right? And so that somehow a real body could be teleported into the digital realm. And so we thought that was really fascinating. Then another film came out called War Games with Matthew Broderick in I think 1982. And there you had phone phreakers, right? I don't know if anybody knows what war dialing is, but in the old days, you would just dial phones randomly until you got a signal you were not supposed to have, and then you drilled into it. And of course, in war games, they drill into an artificial nuclear AI, right? So we thought that gave us an idea, right? Maybe we could find a line. We could be kind of aesthetic freakers, if you will. Then we saw a film called Blade Runner. And that led us into the belief that there was a recombinant theater, that there was not only a data body that virtual capitalism wanted, but there was a genetic clone capitalism that wanted our bodies. So that became then a central motif in our thinking. And the final thing was we read a book called Neuromancer by William Gibson in 1984. And I don't know if you guys have read that, but basically he defines cyberspace as a mass consensual hallucination, right? And so for artists who don't have computers, hell, mass consensual hallucination, we can do that, right? We're in it all the time. But if you read that novel, basically agency is given to two types of techno figures. One, the hacker, who hates the body, who wants to be pure data and is in the streams of data, right? And then the other is Molly Millions, cyborg woman, who introjects all technology and superpower, right? So you have the hacker who doesn't want his body, but is in the stream. You have Molly Millions, who before Donna Haraway, right? Because Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto is 1985. But those are the two agents. But what happens when these two superpowers meet an ice system that is so powerful that neither the hacker nor the cyborg can break in? What do they do? And so in the novel, they go to a agitprop theater art group called the Panther Moderns. And the Panther Moderns create a hallucinogenic space where hackers and cyborgs and the ice bunker don't even know what's real, what doors are real, what ports are real. And this allows then the hacker and Molly Millions to infiltrate the ice system and have a dialogue with the new artificial intelligence being that's emerging, right? So we couldn't be hackers, we couldn't be cyborgs, but we could be the Panther Moderns. And so our thinking in the 80s was we could create the hallucinogenic paradigms of electronic disturbance, electronic civil disobedience as a performative matrix that in the future would allow cyborgs and hackers to enter into the social field of aesthetic or of political agency. But it had to be done by artists. At least that's what we took from that period.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear that inspiration for that sort of thing can come from anywhere. It can come from fiction. So yeah, that's cool to hear.
Applied fiction, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So as somebody who's obviously done a ton of digital activism, we were just wondering what your measure of success is for digital activism, since activism is something that's sort of ongoing. And I was just wondering what you would consider to be a successful digital campaign.
Well, I think we saw it with the deportation class action against Lufthansa, right? There you had a group of people across Germany gathering together, doing different forms of gestures, right? Even now, post 9/11, you couldn't dress like Lufthansa people and go into the airport and share information, right? They'd probably take you away. But nonetheless, we were able to gain critical consciousness using transparent methodology, right? This is what we're going to do. This is why we're going to do it. And then there was a legal outcome that basically said electronic civil disobedience is a right for social protest and contestation. So that, I think, is kind of a unique moment that took like 20 years to get to, right? So we can, and I can point to other actions, but that seemed like the most condensed and compressed one that I could elucidate. Artivism, hacktivism, anonymous doing actions against and in support of Ukraine and many other, I think all those things allow us then to understand that electronic civil disobedience has gained somewhat of an important dialogue and practice in many ways, good, bad, and really good.
Sure, thank you. Kelly, I was wondering if you wanted to jump in with a few questions.
Yeah, mine are wordy, but I feel like I think our students are both sort of politically ambitious and activistly ambitious or protest ambitious, but frustrated politically and in terms of activism. And they feel, as indeed they're supposed to, alienated and isolated from discourses of impactful community activism. And so I guess I just wanted to kind of ask you what lessons they can draw from your history and your work going forward themselves.
Well, I mean, at one end is micro gestures. Gestures can be simple. They don't have to be overly. Remember, I went into a mall and bought toys and a Burger King, and suddenly you had, I wasn't protesting or saying anything. I wasn't blocked, but suddenly you had dialogue and conversations with community about what the nature of things were. Should security forces come and take you away for playing with your toys, your Hot Wheels, right? And it happened at every place we went to. It wasn't just like one instant. So it can be as simple, like one of the things we used to do is create faux information for Sunday papers, right? And then we just go to boxes, put in our quarter, and then just slip information into newspapers, right? That looked like everyday newspapers. We would do radio station ads that we would buy in, like, you know, when people were going to work and coming back. Like we did one called the Accursed Share Card, where a father gives the college student a card and says, well, now you can enter into a zone of waste and destruction, just like everybody else. Oh, thanks, Dad. I love my Accursed Share Card. And then we did another ad called, after a day of pillaging other parts of the world, you really need a good recliner. Join us at Recline of the West, you know, and then you go, oh, honey, you seem tired from destroying most of Central America. Yes, dear, it's hard to be an empire, but now I have the Recline of the West, you know. And so these were 30-second ads. Now, what do they do? For us, it was a disturbance. And so a disturbance doesn't necessarily have a clear, like, you know, this is, you know, this. As artists, we're not sure that our project should be an activist project. Activist is a very different thing. It's going out into the desert, putting out water on a weekly basis, right? Meeting the courts. I mean, I've been an activist, and you have to meet like every week, every day, right? Whereas artists, I can sit there with my friends and go, do you like that blue? I don't know about that blue. Maybe, you know, I went to this wonderful group called Grand Fury, who did the design of Silence Equals Death. The thing was, they were all painters, basically. So they were arguing over the what color pink and white, right? And so only a bunch of artists would sit around and argue, and you would go, but hold it, guys, this is about, packed up, HIV, all these things. And they go, yes, of course, but we have to have an aesthetic, right? So I think that's the question one has to ask. Are you approaching it as artivist, or are you approaching it as activist? And so they work together, but it's two different kinds of research projects. The other thing I would say is that most of my work takes about 10 years, from concept to development to practices to reflection. So if you want to work at a speed level, that's very different than a considered long-term practice, right? You're talking with legal teams, you're talking with on-the-ground community, prison abolition, let us say, right? All these communities who actually do the on-ground research, and then you as artists sort of take that in. So I think it's two different modalities. I've worked in both of them, but most of my work that you see now is within artivism. And so long-term conceptual projects, which isn't easy for a young person to go, what? I got to wait 10 years for this to work? I don't know. But you could do micro gestures, which are fairly, go ahead.
That's a great distinction between artivism and activism. I think that's super important. And I also, the micro gestures is very interesting. It sort of, reminds me a little bit of Berlin Dada, but also has some of that ephemerality of the sort of postmodern, working in the interstices because everything gets co-opted, by corporations so quickly. So I guess I'm wondering about the about FloodNet and denial of service hacking, which you kind of invented, and has become a thing. Anonymous is certainly taking that on, and I'm just curious how you feel about that, what your reflections are, because it's a very different internet, which is to say web, than when you were working and using FloodNet.
Well, I think what's important about our approach was the question of disturbance as an aesthetic project and cyber poetics. So that's what digital zapatismo trained me to consider the aesthetic. So for instance, one of the things that FloodNet did was use the public agora of the browser at that time, the reload function. We used to do the actions by just reloading. And then somebody said, oh, Ricardo, I hurt my fingers after 2 hours. Oh, my finger. And I said, well, that's the pain of activism. But then we said, well, we could just develop a JavaScript that would do it for you, right? The other thing we did was the public 404 file. That is 404 file not found. So we would upload into the Department of Defense, is justice on this site? No, justice is not found. So it wasn't that we were cracking into the system, getting its secrets. We were just using the public agora to say, they don't even have justice in its system, right? It's a negative dialectics, but there was nothing illegal about 404 or reload. The other thing that we were doing was transparency. Our data bodies and real bodies. I would call people, Department of Defense, we're going to come do a virtual sit-in on Friday. You can do view source and look at the JavaScript. I'm here, call me if you have any problems. So this created aesthetic confusion because you're supposed to be secret. You're supposed to be anonymous. The code is supposed to be, super, cryptocurrency type level of things, right? And so the other element was that it was affective rather than effective. So during InfoWar, Ars Electronica, hippies from hell and other people would go, look, if we wanted to take down the Department of Defense, we could do it in a flash, right? And we're going, that's cool if you want to do that, But we were more interested in the issue of disturbance because it was much more difficult for the powers that be to define that as illegal. even though they wanted to do that. In the end, they ended up reading about poetry. They ended up going, what is net art? Right? I mean, these were the questions that came to the foreground. So I would say our work often carries with it an affective sensibility of disturbance. So I knew that if we developed transporter immigrant tool, and this was co-created, again, I'm not thinking these things alone, right? It's not, it's a co-created process. Was, we have to move away from GPS, global positioning system, because they're going to say that's bad. But what if we say it's a global poetic system, because it has poetry? And so then you end up the FBI reading poetry.
Right.
And then they go like, what does this poetry mean? I go, and we go, well, what poem do you like better than the other? Why do you like that poem rather than this poem? So they end up aesthetically confused. And so that's, I think, perhaps the differences between artivism and activism. And so
for students now who are looking to get into either cyber activism or cyber artivism, what's the best way to begin? I personally would encourage reading Neuromancer, among other things. That never seems to go over super popular with my students, but I am curious what you recommend as a starting point for students.
Well, I think you really, for me, are speaking to the ways that I think are important. That is, we often attach the ways to manifest within the structures and infrastructures of the digital via the digital proper. That is, that we have to create another app, that we have to create another platform, another kind of element. But it might be that you have to watch a bunch of old movies, read a bunch of old books, right? Look at Godard's Alphaville. I mean, it's stuff that you go, man, I don't want to do that. But the thing is, I think looking at, for instance, me watching monster movies when I was a kid gave me an idea that what I was being told in school about nuclear bombs might not be correct. Maybe as a little kid, I didn't fully understand, but I knew that there was some relationship, right, that was going on. So I think it's important to do a process of speculative design, of applied fiction, which is that you look at non-digitally based thinking, making, because that might then allow you to route around the kind of bunkers and choices that you already have, right? There's only so many platforms and what have you. Also, we often imagine that these platforms are eternal, right? I could go through a long list of dead ruins of what seem to be digitally eternal machines, right? So I think that's another thing that's important for digital activists, digital artists, is to understand that I think in speculative design, and for us, it is to navigate the ruins yet to come. Because that is, we imagine everything around us as eternal, right? And so reading outside, like the Dadaists, maybe going to the bathroom and put up a show in the stall, as opposed to trying to put it online, right? For instance, one of the things that we did as Critical Art Ensemble is that we would drive around Florida and go to different rest stops. We called it exit culture. And then we would put free postcards in the stalls in the women's and men's bathrooms that told the story of highway culture. How many people died going to Disney World, why the highway was actually built, I don't know. So we gave away these kind of, now, did anybody take those cards? I don't know, right? But it was going off grid. Go to the cultural frontier, we often my students want to go to LA or New York or I don't know where. I say, well, I don't know. I went to Tallahassee, Florida for 10 years. It was inexpensive. I met interesting people. And then I just did research on my own with others. And then when I felt I had a vocabulary and a practice, I went to New York, and nobody could turn me from doing that, right? No curator, no machine. I had one vision, right? So I guess this is a long-winded way. Maybe seek other ways of making than what seems to be the priority formation, which is the digital, which is the app, which is the platform, and be the Panther moderns rather than the hacker or the cyborg. Now, the hacker and the cyborg are important figures, I grant you that, but they might be too busy doing cyborgian and hacking things, right? Activists might be too busy doing important things. So you might develop another formation, another formless formation of activism or artivism in the cultural frontier, where sustenance and survival is not as intense. Create scenes of community that roam, I don't know, and other sustenance, and then come back and tell us what you have discovered. I don't know if that makes any sense whatsoever.
It does. Ricardo, thank you for your generosity in answering all these questions. I appreciate it. I'm going to hand you over to Heather now, because I want to make sure that you have time with the class.
Sure, sure. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Kate. Gracias. Hey, Heather. You muted yourself yet again.
I'm muted. Thank you, Ricardo, for such an incredible presentation. I mean, sharing your incredible history on electronic civil disobedience and the impact of this important activistic and artivistic work. And thanks so much to Professor Kelly Dennis and Kate Campolieta for holding such an incredible dialogue. I mean, wow, just wow. Thank you, muchas gracias. And I'm going to just close off by talking about our next event for those that are out there watching. We've had more than 25 viewers today on YouTube, so thank you all for being there. Our next event will be on Monday, March 21st. We will welcome Jacqueline Beauchamp, the co-founder, chairwoman, and CEO of Engaged Media, LLC, a multi-platform digital media and entertainment company that develops video games, VR, AR, immersive experiences, mobile applications, animated children's books, animated film and motion picture productions to inform, educate, and entertain. And check out the entire rich lineup of our diverse perspectives in digital media and design 2022 speaker series at dmd.uconn.edu/diverse. And don't forget to subscribe to us here on YouTube and follow us with @UConnDMD. Thanks to everyone behind the work, and I hope all of you were as inspired today about the history and the possibilities of artivism and what we can do as we were within this Zoom room. There's a lot of work to be done on the border. We've got a war in Ukraine right now. There's so much opportunity for people, students in particular, that want to make a difference and use their skills and their passion. So I hope that we can continue to inspire and mentor our young creatives, and together that we can change this digital world for the better. Thank you and have a good week.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.